It's October 17th, 1781, in Yorktown, Virginia. The sound of a drum breaks through the early morning quiet. A single British drummer beats his drum somewhere in the distance. The patriots' eyes widen at the sound. Their jaws drop. They know this beat. It means truce. It means surrender. After a 20-day siege, the British are out of food. They're out of artillery. They are trapped. They have no choice but to surrender. The men assemble. American General Washington stands side by side with French General Rochambeau. Someone approaches the British line, carrying a sword. But it's not who they were expecting. It's not General Cornwallis. It's his second in command, General O'Hara. He makes some sort of excuse. Cornwallis is not feeling well. He attempts to hand the sword off to General Rochambeau, clearly unwilling to accept Washington as worthy. The British have been fighting the French forever. Losing to the French is familiar. Losing to the Americans is unthinkable. Rochambeau shakes his head and gestures towards Washington by his side. O'Hara grimaces, turns, and reluctantly offers the sword to the American general. Washington refuses the sword too, and instructs O'Hara to give it to his second-in-command, General Lincoln, instead. If Cornwallis won't play the game, neither will he. With the thing done, a seemingly endless line of redcoats approaches. The British soldiers lay down their weapons, lining them up in the middle of the field. Their drummers beat out a mournful rhythm, a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." For the British, the world had turned upside down. Less than a month before, they had approached Yorktown, Virginia with full confidence. What had gone wrong? Well, that was really more of a who. An enslaved black man named James. A man the British had mistakenly trusted, a man who helped turn the tide of the American Revolution, a man most people have still never heard of. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and this is History Fix, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. I have a really incredible story for you today. This is one of those that I come across quite often, actually, that really should be a movie. Actually, I Googled whether there was a movie about James Armistead Lafayette, and there isn't. And that's honestly such a missed opportunity because this story is awesome. There was a movie that came out recently, Young Washington. No, I haven't seen it. I'm not going to throw out opinions about a movie I haven't seen, but I get a lot of Christian nationalism vibes from it. Let's just say that. And I don't know. George Washington has been glorified plenty. I just feel like we're good on that. Like, it's so played out. James Armistead Lafayette, where is his movie? Here, let me tell you the story, and I think you'll agree. James, first of all, James was just James. He never actually went by the last name Armistead during his life, although that's how he's remembered. Lafayette will come in later. But James was just James. He was born enslaved in either North Carolina or Virginia in either 1748 or 1760. Fuzzy details there, of course, because he was enslaved, and records like this were not kept for enslaved people. At some point, James became the property of, I don't like that wording, he was enslaved by a Colonel John Armistead in New Kent County, Virginia. So this is where the last name Armistead comes in. Technically, his name would have been James Armistead at that point, but he never personally used that last name. That's why I said he was just James. Colonel John Armistead died in 1779, but even before that, he had transferred James to his son, William. So James had become the first man enslaved by young William Armistead. Now, we know that James was taught to read and write, while he was enslaved by the Armistead family, which wasn't illegal in Virginia yet. In the 1700s, it would become illegal later on in the 1800s, but it wasn't illegal yet at that time. But it was still quite rare. The Revolutionary War started in April of 1775, and by June, George Washington was unanimously chosen to lead the Continental Army as commander-in-chief. Now, Washington enslaved people. I have a whole episode about Washington, if you missed it, episode 69. That's the real young Washington. But Washington enslaved people, and so he was very uncomfortable with the idea of arming Black people, of giving enslaved people weapons, guns. He was not cool with that at all. And so he did not want enslaved Black men in his army. He didn't want them to fight in the Continental Army because it meant he would have to give them guns. He didn't want to do that. By July 10th, 1775, rules were in place barring Black men from joining the Continental Army. And this was honestly really dumb. And that wasn't lost on their enemies. In November, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to any enslaved men who joined his British forces. And many, many did. Caitlin Healy writes for the U.S. Army National Museum, quote, Lord Dunmore hoped for a full-scale slave revolt, something that many Southern founding fathers like Washington and Thomas Jefferson were terrified of. Such a revolt never materialized. It has been estimated that only 800 to 1,000 Virginia slaves joined Loyalist forces. However, upon hearing news of the Dunmore Proclamation, as many as 100,000 enslaved people from all 13 colonies ran to British lines to escape slavery. End quote. And can you even blame them? Later in the war, this stance by Washington to not let Black people fight in the Continental Army, it began to change out of necessity. They needed men, any men, white, Black, purple, whatever. Soon it didn't matter. They were desperate for troops. This decision to allow Black men to join the army was helped along by a young French officer with a very long name. Officially, his name was Marie-Joseph Paul Ives Roche Gilbert de Motier, Marquis de Lafayette. But mostly, he's just known as the Marquis de Lafayette, thankfully. Lafayette's path will soon cross with that of James, currently enslaved by William Armistead over in New Kent County, Virginia. But first, let me tell you his backstory. Lafayette was born into a wealthy family in France in 1757. This was a military family. They were serious about military things, so much so that Lafayette was actually commissioned as a military officer when he was only 13 years old. But by the time he was 19, he was an orphan, a very wealthy orphan who desperately wanted military glory, the only thing his now deceased parents really valued. I'm sure there's a lot to unpack psychologically there. But Lafayette wants military glory. Mostly he wants to avenge France against their longtime rival, Great Britain. The problem is, there aren't currently any conflicts going on in Europe. It's all peaceful right now, believe it or not. So he decides to go to America, where conflict is a-brewing with Great Britain. Lafayette was also really into the Enlightenment movement of this time period, which was all about the concepts of liberty and the pursuit of freedom. So he's all for American independence, and he's looking for a fight with the British. It's perfect. The only problem was the French king, Louis XVI, had actually explicitly banned the French from fighting with the Americans. He was like, we're sitting this one out. So Lafayette, at 19 years old, he bought his own ship called Victory, and he used it to sneak out of France, defying the king's orders. He gets to America, the 13 colonies at the time. He joins the cause. He develops a tight relationship with George Washington. It's often described as a sort of father-son relationship because remember, Lafayette is like a teenager at the time, right? And Lafayette is one of the guys helping to convince Washington that he needs to let Black men fight already, you dum-dum. Now let's go back to James in New Kent County. James has three choices right now. He can carry on being enslaved by William Armistead. He can fight for the Americans, risk his life for almost zero personal gain, and then go right back to being enslaved afterwards. Or he can fight for the British and receive his freedom. Which of the three would you choose? The one where you probably die and definitely still aren't free afterwards? Yeah, me neither. But that's the one James chooses. For whatever reason, we're really not sure why he does this. It makes no sense, honestly, fighting for a country that's fighting for freedom yet refuses to grant you yours, refuses to view you as a human being. But James was not the only one. Thousands of enslaved Black men fought as patriots in the war. Something like 3.5% of the Continental Army was Black. Many of them were sadly forced to, sent in their enslavers' stead. Many others, like James, just chose to fight. We know that James enslaver William Armistead was a passionate patriot and that he served as a commissary in charge of food and supplies for Virginia troops during the war. And we know that James volunteered his services as well. He ended up volunteering under none other than General Lafayette, French rich kid with a boat and a dream. Lafayette sees a lot of potential in James, not as a soldier, though. He's not going to make James a soldier and likely march him to his death. He has much bigger plans, more strategic plans for James, because James is enslaved and he can read and write. Lafayette latches on to those details and he hatches a brilliant plan. James is going to be a spy. Lafayette sent James right into the heart of the British War Department, posing as a runaway slave. He goes to British General Cornwallis, the British version of George Washington, basically, and he pretends to be a runaway slave, hoping to join British forces. Lafayette knows that they'll take him because James has extensive knowledge of Virginian terrain. He knows this area, and they don't. And they trust him because they think he's after the freedom that they're offering him. And they don't know he can read and write because he's enslaved, right? Enslaved people can't read and write. They aren't educated. And so they completely underestimate him. James is the perfect spy. So the British take him in. Ironically, he was even ordered by Cornwallis to spy on Lafayette. So he's a double agent, basically. He's really spying for the Americans, but the British think that he's spying for them. So in this way, he has access to both sides, the higher-ups on both sides. He worked as a courier for the British, carrying documents, information between their camps. They honestly made his job easy. So he gathers all these details about British plans, and he tells them to Lafayette. He also plants false information about American plans to try to throw off the British. More irony, during this time he spends spying on the British as a sort of double agent, he comes into direct contact with another even more famous trickster, Benedict Arnold. I'm going to dedicate next week's mini-fix to Benedict Arnold, but I'll briefly fill you in here. Benedict Arnold was an American. He was born in Connecticut. He joined the Continental Army and quickly rose through the ranks all the way to Major General. He was a favorite of George Washington, who had full faith in him. So much faith that he actually put him in charge of West Point in New York, which today is a military academy, but back then it was a fort. It was a stronghold. It was in this really critical position on the Hudson River. And if the British were to gain control of that area, they would split the colonies in two, which is bad for obvious reasons. Washington called West Point the, quote, key of America. And he trusted Benedict Arnold so much that he put him in charge of defending it. This was a major mistake because Benedict Arnold had secretly switched sides. He was a turncoat, and he was planning to hand West Point to the British on a silver platter. But luckily, this plot was discovered in September of 1780, and so Benedict Arnold was forced to flee to British lines, or, face punishment for treason. He had committed treason, the worst possible sort of treason. And so he's taken in by the British. He's made a brigadier general. I don't really know what that means, but it sounds fancy. And so while secretly working for the Americans under Lafayette, James pretends to work for both General Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold. By 1781, it's about to go down in Yorktown, Virginia. Cornwallis is going to Yorktown for supplies. The British Navy is supposed to meet him there with supplies, and then they'll evacuate them. They'll get them out of there by way of the water, right? So they don't have to march back across the land. So that's the plan. In and out. Get some stuff, get out of there. Well, it's not the British Navy that meets them. Instead, it's the French fleet blocking the Chesapeake Bay. Why French? I thought the French were sitting this one out. Well, they were originally. That's why Lafayette had to buy his own boat and sneak out of France. But then more and more support for the Americans started to grow in France, thanks to Lafayette and other men like him, really. Lafayette had returned to France in 1779 to lobby King Louis XVI and the French ministers for troops, and the Navy sent help to the Americans, and they eventually did do that. Why? Why did the French decide to support the Americans? What's in it for them? To hurt Great Britain and avenge their loss in the 7 Years' War, basically. Pretty petty reasons, but whatever. We'll take it. And so the French fleet is blocking Cornwallis' escape out of Yorktown in 1781. He has to go by land. No problem. He'll just call in some backup from nearby Portsmouth, Virginia. 10,000 troops should do. Except James finds this out. He finds out about the 10,000 reinforcements planning to come help rescue Cornwallis, and he tells Lafayette, who tells Washington and the French general Rochambeau. And with this information, they jump into high gear, planning a successful bombardment that catches the British totally off guard. The reinforcements can't get to them, and they are really and truly trapped in Yorktown. They can't escape by land or sea now, and eventually, with no supplies and no escape, running out of artillery, they have no choice but to surrender. Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown did not officially end the Revolutionary War. It wouldn't officially end until almost 2 years later with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. But it was the last final major land battle, and it was arguably the most significant American victory in the war. It basically broke the British. It shattered their resolve to keep fighting. There would be more skirmishes afterwards, but they would sort of fizzle out more and more until the British just gave in, signing the treaty that lost them their American colonies in 1783. Without the surrender at Yorktown, the war may have ended very differently. And without James' warning about the 10,000 troops from Portsmouth, that surrender may have never happened. So what happened to James? We know Lafayette was all about the honor and the glory, and he undoubtedly got it. But what about James? James agreed to this arrangement with the understanding that there would be no honor and glory, that he would return to his enslaver, William Armistead, afterwards. But things had changed since then. In 1783, Virginia passed a Manumission Act, which said that any enslaved person who fought in the Revolutionary War was free. However, this only applied to enslaved people who were issued firearms, typically those serving as soldiers in place of their white enslavers. James was not a soldier. He was a spy. He was never issued a gun. And so he was omitted from this Manumission Act, and he did not receive his freedom. But don't worry, that injustice will not stand. With the support of both his enslaver, William Armistead, and none other than General Lafayette himself, who wrote a letter to the General Assembly in 1784 explaining James' contributions to the war effort. He's basically like, guys, he did the whole thing. He won the war. We couldn't have won it without him. We literally might have lost the whole war without this dude. Not really. Actually, that's what I would have said. What he actually said was, quote, "The petition of James, a slave belonging to Will Armistead of New Kent County, humbly sheweth that your petitioner persuaded of the just right which all mankind have to freedom, notwithstanding his own state of bondage, with an honest desire to serve this country in its defense thereof did, during the ravages of Lord Cornwallis through this state by the permission of his master, enter into the service of the Marquis Lafayette, that during the time of his serving the Marquis, he often at the peril of his life found means to frequent the British camp, by which means he kept open a channel of the most useful communication to the army of the state. That at different times your petitioner conveyed enclosures from the Marquis into the enemy lines, of the most secret and important kind, the possession of which, if discovered on him, would have most certainly endangered the life of your petitioner. That he undertook and performed all commands with cheerfulness and fidelity in opposition to the persuasion and example of many thousands of his unfortunate condition. For proof of the above, your petitioner begs leave to refer to certificate of the Marquis Lafayette hereto annexed, and after taking his case as here stated into consideration, he humbly entreats that he may be granted that freedom, which he flatters himself he has in some degrees contributed to establish, and which he hopes always to prove himself worthy of. Nor does he desire even this inestimable favor, unless his present master, from whom he has experienced everything which can make tolerable the state of slavery, shall be made adequate compensation for the loss of a valuable workman, which your petitioner humbly requests may be done, and your petitioner shall ever pray." End quote. James did receive his freedom in 1787, 3 years later. Not sure why it took 3 years, but whatever. As a way of saying thanks for this letter, James adopted the last name Lafayette in 1787 when he became free. And then he's really living the life, guys. Like, things go very well for James after this. He bought his own farm in Virginia, 40 acres, a 40-acre farm, a very profitable farm. He got married. He raised a family. He even enslaved people. Yeah, a formerly enslaved person enslaved people. This was less rare than you might think. This was a thing. This was done. We know that he enslaved 3 people, but we don't know the circumstances. We don't know if he enslaved these people to work on his farm, or if they were possibly enslaved family members or other relations that he purchased in order to protect them and give them unofficial freedom, because that is also something that was done. We don't know. But, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for James after he became free. Of course, he's still a black man in, late 1700s, early 1800s America, free or not. Despite petitioning for it, we know that he didn't start receiving his pension for serving in the Revolutionary War until 1819, which is 27 years after the war ended. In 1824, James and the Marquis de Lafayette were reunited. Lafayette had returned to France after the war, got himself involved in the French Revolution, very revolutionary guy, super into that kind of thing. But in 1824, Lafayette was invited back to the United States by President James Monroe for a sort of tour, like a throwback victory tour of sorts. He toured all 24 states, because there were only 24 at the time. He visited Yorktown. He visited George Washington's grave at Mount Vernon. Washington had died back in 1799. And while Lafayette was in Virginia, he gave a speech to the Virginia General Assembly in Richmond. And who should be in the crowd there but James Armistead Lafayette? General Lafayette stopped his carriage, hopped out, and hugged James right there in the crowd. Big old bear hug. I love that for a lot of reasons. It's equalizing. Lafayette greets other Lafayette, James, a man who took his name out of respect, as an equal. And really, Lafayette seems to be the only one in this story who really respected James. James. Lafayette saw the potential in James. Washington feared him. Cornwallis underestimated him. Lafayette saw him as a fellow human with potential that paid off tremendously at the surrender of Yorktown. Lafayette was willing to take a chance on James, and James, for some reason that's hard to even fathom, was willing to put his life on the line for a country that refused to grant him his freedom, refused to see him as a fellow human. Caitlin Healy words it perfectly when she writes in that article, quote, "It is the pinnacle of irony that the United States was born from a war for independence that depended in part on people who were enslaved." End quote. James died probably in 1830, the year that he took his last pension, or maybe in 1832, according to other reports, making him somewhere between 70 and 84 years old. A 14-year range. Both his birth years and his death years are uncertain. And that says a lot. George Washington, he was 67 years and 295 days old when he died. We know that precisely. James Lafayette was an unsung American hero, a double agent at tremendous personal risk, infiltrating the belly of the beast, the Severus Snape of American history, if you will. And to quote Harry Potter, he was probably the bravest man I ever knew. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.